Okay, so shall we start or shall we wait just a couple of minutes or?
I mean, we normally start at 5. Now it's 6 past 5 our time. So I would start 5 minutes. Otherwise, if people know that every week we add 2 minutes, we'll
yes, all right.
Then we start the Italian mood.
Exactly.
The slippery slope.
Exactly.
Okay, so I'm honored of introducing our speaker, today's speaker, Nancy Snow. She's very well known within virtue ethics studies. She is a director of the Institute for the Study of Human Flourishing, University of Oklahoma, and she's very familiar with our topics, with our conferences, either in the RTI congresses and all the most important conferences all around the world about virtue ethics. She published a lot of work, very valuable. I just don't want to, waste more time, and I give the floor to Nancy for today's conference. The floor is yours. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Claudia, and thank you everybody for having me here. It's wonderful to see so many friends from Italy. So thank you once again. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Okay, so can everybody see that?
Yes.
Great. So what I'm going to do today is just to give you a PowerPoint presentation on a paper entitled Phronesis and Whole Trait Theory. And this, this paper really was published in an edited volume, Practical Wisdom, Philosophical and Psychological Perspectives, edited by Mario De Caro and Maria Silvia Baccarezza. And just to give you an overview, what I'm going to do here is to discuss a neo-Aristotelian conception of phronesis, which tracks Aristotle's conception fairly closely, but with possibly a couple of departures, and then contextualize it within whole trait theory. Some of you might be familiar with this. Whole trait theory is a recent development in terms of conceptualizing virtues that has been launched by psychologists in the United States, namely Will Fleeson and Aranda Jayowick-Ramey. And the question that I've put here on this slide is why do this? And so what this presentation does is to expand upon some of the work that two developmental psychologists and I did in a book entitled Understanding Virtue Theory and Measurement. And there, what we did was to try to develop a neo-Aristotelian conception of virtue using whole trait theory that can be integrated with whole trait theory to provide a conception of virtue that is amenable to measurement by psychologists. And this really takes the discussion one step further to try to apply it to phronesis. We talk a little bit about phronesis in the book, but this paper in the presentation take that a little further. So just to start off, the neo-Aristotelian conception of phronesis that we adopt in this paper, and by we, I mean myself and my two colleagues from psychology, Jennifer Cole-Wright and Michael Warren, we identify 4 different roles for phronesis: action guidance, the regulation of virtues within character, emotion regulation, and reflection on one's life as a whole. So just that first point, action guidance, this should be very familiar to people who are conversant with virtue theory. So phronesis is the deliberation that guides virtuous action so that the action successfully hits the target of virtue. And that should be pretty familiar. So if I want to be generous and give you a gift on your birthday, phronesis is what guides my action. So I should think about what you like, not what not about what I like, for example, and by something that you like, by something that will please you. So this is the way in which deliberation, we deliberate about what people like. And in order to be generous, we hit the intermediate state, we hit the mean. We're neither excessive in terms of what we give, nor are we stingy, okay? So there's a mean state that virtue consists in, and Phronesis really helps us hit that with our actions. The second role for Phronesis is that it can regulate a multiplicity of virtues within character. So, for example, adjudicating in cases of conflict. Should I be just or should I be merciful? Tempering, okay? Maybe I need to be honest with someone, but I should at least be tactful in terms of how I'm honest so that I don't come across as unnecessarily harsh or hurtful. Maybe I need to integrate virtues. Maybe I need to integrate proper pride with humility, for example. Maybe I should prioritize a virtue. Maybe I should start being more compassionate instead of being, oblivious, or, instead of being just, maybe I should be more merciful. And then checking and balancing. And here again, we can refer to proper pride and humility. So pride can keep us from becoming servile, from becoming, you might say, excessive in our attempts to be humble. So those should all be familiar. Another role for Phronesis is emotion regulation. And here my colleagues and I are relying on a piece on Phronesis by Catherine Darnell and Christian Christensen, among others. So Phronesis ensures that our emotional responses are appropriate for the virtues we have in exercise, and that they don't interfere with other elements of virtues, such as motivations, thoughts, and desires, as well as with our exercise of other virtues. So, again, to take compassion as an example, we might feel really sorry for people who are undergoing some kind of a plight. But if we feel too much for them, we might not be able to think clearly about what they need. So you can think of a healthcare provider and how those healthcare providers really sort of have to moderate their compassion in order to deliver appropriate care. So the exercise of other virtues also comes into play here, because sometimes if we are overly compassionate, we can't be just. And I think about some of my students who want to turn in their papers late, and I'm inclined to be compassionate, but then you have to think about the other students who get their papers in on time. So there are all kinds of ways of thinking about how these emotions can upset both the other elements of the same virtue and the exercise of other virtues, unless they are kept regulated. And Phronesis helps us to regulate those emotions. Finally, another role, the fourth role for Phronesis, has to do with a flourishing life. So Phronesis helps us to reflect on our life as a whole. It helps in the formation of moral identity. So using Phronesis, we can identify or disidentify with certain traits. So I might think to myself, if I am tempted to do something, that's not who I am, right? So suppose that I'm tempted to cheat on my tax returns, and I just say to myself, no. I might be able to get away with this, but that's not the person I am. And similarly, you might think, well, I'm not an angry person, okay? So I might really feel like I want to kind of let somebody have it, but then I think, well, no, that's just not who I am. I'm going to take a deep breath and count to 100 or something like that. And Phronesis is really what helps us to regulate ourselves in the moment in light of this moral identity to which we aspire. Okay, now, my colleagues and I want to distinguish our view about a flourishing life from two other views. So we don't endorse the grand view, and we don't endorse the blueprint view. Now, the grand end view is the view that phronesis informs and is informed by an explicit and comprehensive conception of the good, which is available only to philosophers and experienced statespersons, not to ordinary people. Pardon me. We find this too elitist, and it's probably straight from a pretty, strict interpretation of Aristotle. But and I'm happy to be corrected on that. I'm not an Aristotle scholar myself, but you can find the grand end view in Aristotle. But we don't accept this. We think it's just too restrictive. And the blueprint view is weaker. And according to the blueprint view, an explicit conception of the good informs and is informed by phronesis, but it's available to ordinary persons who have been raised well. So the blueprint orders the ends and aims of one's life as a whole and is ideally on call to guide one's actions. And that is discussed in Darnell and Christian's article. Now, as I mentioned, my colleagues and I find that grand end view too elitist, but we also have reasons for rejecting the blueprint view. So one reason is that we want to allow roles for phronesis in the reflections that actually construct the blueprint. So as we understand the blueprint view, the blueprint already exists, and phronesis sort of helps us to live it out and then changes or adjusts it from time to time. But we think phronesis has roles to play in actually putting the blueprint together. So that's sort of a developmental point, okay? But we also believe that even people who have been raised well, who haven't been raised well and consequently don't have a blueprint for living well, can nevertheless acquire virtue through phronetic reflections on the kind of person they want to become. So even if you don't have at your disposal this wonderful blueprint for living your life, you can still use phronesis to construct a blueprint, even if you haven't lived well, been raised well. So just to explain a little bit more, there is an objection and a reply to this last point. So the objection is that phronesis is required for virtue, and virtue is required for phronesis. And so that is straight from Aristotle's view of the reciprocity thesis. Or the unity of virtues thesis. So if someone lacks virtue, according to this account, phronetic reflections won't be available to her. So my colleagues and I think that anecdotal evidence doesn't support this view. People are capable of moral improvement. So sometimes one has an epiphany, right? One wakes up and resolves to change, right? But even in cases that don't involve this sort of epiphany about your life, it's relevant that neither virtue nor phronesis is a binary concept, meaning that you either have them or you don't. They can develop gradually and incrementally over time. So we don't think that the blueprint view really captures everything there is to capture about moral development, and that people don't need to have a kind of blueprint that's worked out in order to live well. I think this is especially true at certain times of a person's life. So if you think about the younger people that the college students that surely they don't have a blueprint of how their life is going to work out. I'm getting older now and I still don't have a blueprint about how my life is going to work out. But that's okay because, now I think maybe I have phronesis and maybe my students have some phronesis and they can use that to construct a blueprint. So they can use it to construct a blueprint and also to affect moral change. So I think that, the blueprint view probably is a little bit overambitious in terms of the sort of cognitions that it attributes to people who live well. And of course, I'm happy to answer any kinds of questions when we get through the presentation. Now, in addition to the 4 roles for phronesis, my colleagues and I identify 5 parts of phronesis, and here we follow Dan Russell in his book, Practical Intelligence and the Virtues. But Russell thinks that phronesis is comprised of a suite of 5 different virtues of the practical intellect. We don't think these are distinct virtues, but rather 5 different parts of phronesis. And we identify them, following Russell, as comprehension, sense, intelligence, deliberative excellence, and cleverness. Now, these aren't well understood due to ambiguities in the interpretation of Aristotle's texts. So, and we left them out of our book because we thought that because they are not well understood, they're not very good candidates for measurement. So it's possible. I know that a lot of work is being done on phronesis, including the edited collection in which this paper appears. So it's possible that we will make headway in terms of clarifying these concepts, their roles in phronesis, and measurement strategies that apply to them. But let's look at each of them in turn. So comprehension is the ability to read a situation or to reflect correctly about a person's words or actions, and is a crucial part of deliberation. So, you know, if you go into a room and you notice that people in that room seem to be rather tense, comprehension helps you to understand what's going on. It helps you to understand that people in the room are tense. It can help you to reflect on what someone says or how they act. And that is needed to deliberate about how you should act in those situations. Sense is a discrimination of what is reasonable and appropriate. And so here's a nice quote from Russell. Aristotle emphasizes that a person with sense has sympathy. And as Robert Loudon has remarked, this suggests an ability to see things from another's point of view in deliberating about what is reasonable or appropriate. So to us, this sounds like perspective taking. Okay, it sounds like sense helps us to figure out what's reasonable and appropriate in any given situation by enabling us to take the perspective of the other person, right? So suppose that, you know, a student is very upset about her grade on an exam or something like that. Well, you know, it helps me to figure out where she's coming from by trying to take her perspective on what that exam means in her situation with her grade point average, with her career plans and so forth. And these are all very familiar concepts and very familiar examples. So nous or intelligence is more complex, as it, quote, appears in both theoretical and practical reasoning, end quote. So Aristotle compares intelligence and practical reasoning to visual perception. Those with intelligence have acquired through experience something like a perceptual capacity that gives them insight into how best to act virtuously. So this involves problem-solving abilities that are built over time through experience. It's kind of difficult to get your mind around this, I think. I mean, what intelligence and practical reasoning would be that compares with visual perception? But it would just be something like you see something that is going on, and over time, after you have seen this sort of situation unfold, or this sort of behavior unfold, you can develop abilities to deal with it through your experiences. And so maybe we can think about a situation that is kind of familiar, and that is, we can tell, I think, past a certain point, when somebody is on the verge of tears, right? You know when somebody becomes upset. You know when they're on the verge of tears. And so you can visually see this, but also you are able, through the use of intelligence, to know that this is from someone's actually being upset and not through some other cause, right? So here in Oklahoma, allergies abound during certain parts of the year. So we could see that somebody is in tears, but maybe it's caused by their allergies, right? However, intelligence allows us to know when somebody is simply having an allergic reaction, or when someone has been upset by emotional factors or other things that are going on. And so this intelligence allows us to problem solve abilities. In the case of the person with the allergic reaction, I might offer them a tissue. In the case of the person with who is emotionally upset, I might offer them a tissue and words of consolation, right? So there is something going on there that is different in the two cases. And it's not simply visual perception, but it's also intelligence that allows us to know what to do. Deliberative excellence is grasping the correct ends in one's deliberations and how to take the right steps toward them. So unlike Phronesis as a whole, which has a grasp of the global human good, deliberative excellence allows us to aim for more specific goods. So what should I do in my career? Should I seek to retire or should I move to another institution? So these are real questions that do come up in our lives, and deliberative excellence enables us to figure out which one is right for us at this particular moment and how we should go about getting that end. So if I decide that that retirement is right for me, I have to check different websites. I have to figure out Medicare. I have to figure out all the kinds of crazy lack of health insurance options that are here in the United States. If I want to move to a different institution, I have to check with my colleagues about what kinds of opportunities might be available. So there again, we have a fairly straightforward, I think, example of what deliberative excellence does. So cleverness is the last part of phronesis, and it is good means ends reasoning, okay? So whereas someone can have cleverness without phronesis, someone can be clever without being virtuous, she cannot have phronesis without cleverness. So cleverness, as Aristotle conceives of it, can be directed toward ends that are good, bad, or neutral. As part of phronesis, it's always directed toward good ends. So cleverness enables us to figure out how best to comfort someone who is in distress, okay? It can also enable us to figure out the best way to kill our enemy, right? But when cleverness is used to help somebody in distress, it's part of phronesis, right? Because it's a good end to comfort somebody in distress. When cleverness is used to help us kill our enemy, that's a bad end, right? I mean, presuming that we fill out the examples in the correct way, presuming that your enemy doesn't deserve to die at your hands, okay? So cleverness is interesting, but ambiguity abounds. So there's a lot of ambiguity in the parts of phronesis. One could well ask, for example, whether cleverness is included in deliberative excellence or is separate from it. And in the paper, we don't attempt to answer these questions. Pardon me. And we don't have ready answers to them. And we don't really have a way of sorting through some of these overlaps in the parts that emerge from our discussion. But we do conceptualize the parts as falling into two basic groups: comprehension, sense, and intelligence, which have mainly to do with our abilities to perceive virtue-relevant stimuli, and deliberative excellence and cleverness, which mainly have to do with our abilities to formulate virtuous ends and the means to attain them. Okay, so in the paper, what we try to do is to work through some examples to show how these work out. But I'm not going to talk about that right now. Maybe we can talk about that in the question and answer period. What I'd rather do is to talk about phronesis and how it's integrated into whole trait theory. So I don't know how many people are familiar with whole trait theory, but it has a descriptive side and an explanatory side. So the descriptive side is represented by the frequency with which a person behaves in a trait-appropriate manner over time and in different situational circumstances. So Michel, for example, has a lot of compassion. I know him, he's a very compassionate guy. And so he is going to act compassionately a lot of times in a lot of different situations. And that's Michel's trait of compassion, or his virtue being manifested. Now, I am not a compassionate person, so my compassion isn't going to be nearly as frequent as Michel's, nor will it play out in as many different situational circumstances. Basically, I'm compassionate only toward my cats. Okay, so Michelle has a much broader scope of compassion. But the explanatory side explains all of this, right? So the explanatory side consists of the underlying social cognitive systems that are responsible for producing this person-specific distribution of trait-appropriate responses. So there's a little bit of psychological jargon for you, okay? The social cognitive systems, as we'll see, consist of several different interlocking systems, but they produce the responses, right, that both Michelle and I have in specific situations. And since those social cognitive systems were developed differently in Michelle and me, they explain why we act the way we do in these situations, right? So there is a social learning history that each of us has that shapes these systems within us, and how we interact to produce these behaviors. So the position of myself and my colleagues is that virtues are a subset of traits whose structures and processes align with those postulated in whole trait theory. So whole trait theory holds that traits are robust dispositional capacities for trait-appropriate behavior, and that behavior is typically manifest to the degree to which there is reason for it to be. So rationality is kind of built into whole trait theory there. Whether there is reason for a trait to be manifested depends upon the presence or absence of situationally encountered stimuli that are trait relevant, that is, that call for the exercise of the trait. So trait manifestation is typically the result of the perception of trait relevant stimuli, the input, which is processed by social cognitive systems, the intermediates, and results in the production of a set of situation-specific trait-appropriate responses, the outputs, okay? Thus, in order to reliably manifest a trait, the person must be disposed to accurately perceive whatever trait-relevant stimuli are present in the surrounding external and internal environments, and process them in such a way as to produce trait-appropriate responses. So by external environments, we simply mean stimuli coming from outside the person. Internal environments could be thoughts, memories, and so forth that are internal to the person. So frequently, both internal and external environments are needed in order to produce trait-relevant behavior. And we can talk about this, of course. We'll unpack this further. So how does phronesis fit in? So let's note that whole trait theory doesn't explicitly mention phronesis, but we think it can accommodate it. So the first thing that I'd like to talk about is phronesis and perception, which has to do with the inputs. So recall that whole trait theory really talks about inputs, intermediates, and outputs. So phronesis and perception has to do with, first, the inputs. So the first role for phronesis that we mentioned was action guidance, okay? And with respect to action guidance, both comprehension and intelligence come into play, right? So comprehension is the ability to read a situation, and it's essential for the perception of when virtuous action is called for. So for example, we see someone being bullied and know that we should act. So that is a role for phronesis in perception with respect to the inputs. Comprehension is a part of phronesis that enables us to perceive the inputs needed for action guidance, okay? Now, nous or intelligence is also involved here, because it goes beyond comprehension by involving a component of problem-solving ability that's built up over time and experience. So nous enables us to know how best to act virtuously in given situations. So I perceive that someone is being bullied. That's part of the input. Comprehension enables me to pick up on that. I know that I should act, but nous or intelligence gives me information on what I should do. Okay, should I confront the bully? Okay, that's one question. Well, maybe I should, maybe I shouldn't, right? Maybe if I am a student watching another student in a grade school bully a person, I should find a teacher, okay? So nous or intelligence might give me different guidance about how to act. And this is something that I store up as I act in these situations in order to find which approach works best in which situation. So there's always going to be the perception of the input and then deliberation, a little bit of deliberation about how best to act here. So what we see now is that perception alone, it's very difficult to sort of separate these things out, right? Perception sort of bleeds into or spills over into deliberation in terms of action guidance. But without that perception that a virtuous action is required, you're not going to be able to act. So there's a second role for phronesis and inputs or perception, which is adjudicating amongst virtues. So the same parts of phronesis that allows us to know when a single virtue is called for and to act could also allow us to perceive when multiple virtues might come into play in the same situation, and that some can sometimes conflict, for example, justice and mercy, okay? So it gets more complicated, but then comprehension allows us to perceive that both of these virtues might be required, and intelligence or nous then comes into play in deliberating about which one should in fact be enacted. But owing to one's life circumstances, one's capacities for perceiving some virtues, some situations in which virtue is required could be more highly developed than others. So in these cases, perception really affects subsequent deliberation, okay? So for example, Michel might be very highly trained in compassion. So he's going to always opt for a compassionate response in situations that might call for multiple virtues, whereas I might not, right? Because my capacity for perceiving situations calling for compassion is less highly developed. It's less highly attuned to those situations, okay? So I do want to make one note on this, and that is, following Aristotle, phronesis is one, okay? It's unified. It's comprised of 5 parts, but these capacities are unified and not differentiated in response to specific virtues. So they all work together. We can talk about them analytically, and we can try to separate out the different roles that they play, but in actual life, in actual experience, they all work together. So there is not one version of phronesis that allows us to detect compassion and another that allows us to detect mercy, right? There's just one entire quality or characteristic of phronesis that comes into play with respect to different virtues, and that can be used to distinguish what virtues are appropriate in any given situation. Sorry about this. Here is the third role for phronesis and inputs perception, and that's emotion regulation. So just as in the case of action guidance, both comprehension and nous allow us to perceive when specific virtuous emotional responses are called for. So comprehension and nous, for example, can allow us to detect situations in which a sympathetic response is needed, situations in which a merciful response is needed, or situations in which we might react with righteous indignation when we perceive an injustice occurring, right? So that, I think, sort of follows from the other points that have been made about phronesis and inputs. But also, sense or sympathy also comes into play, since it helps us to take the kinds of perspective needed to discern and possibly share the emotional experiences of others, right? So if I see someone who is suffering, maybe I will also share their suffering, and sense or sympathy allows us to do that. And that is different both from simply the perception that action is needed and the deliberation about what action is required, as well as the perception that perhaps multiple virtues are coming into play, right? So when we talk about sharing the emotional experiences of others, we're talking about sense or sympathy. However, sometimes we shouldn't share their perspectives or emotional experiences. And here we go from mere perception, you might say, into the realm of judgment. So in judgment, in judging that I shouldn't share someone's emotional experiences, I'm really judging that my role needs to be separate from theirs, right? So you might think of, again, a healthcare giver who is aware that someone is suffering, but needs not to share in that suffering in order to deliver the appropriate health care, right? Or you might think of a situation in which someone is suffering because of a wrong that they have committed. Well, I don't want to share in that suffering because I haven't done that wrong, right? So I might want to distance myself from that suffering. So we get a little bit more complicated in terms of sense or sympathy than in comprehension and intelligence. Finally, the fourth role for phronesis and inputs or perception is reflection on one's life as a whole. So here we might reflect on experiences we've had in our lives, and this takes us into the perception of internal stimuli. For example, thoughts, including memories. So then those are what we perceive, really, through comprehension. We remember something that happened. We then invoke intelligence in the sense that we deliberate about it, not maybe with respect to doing some action guidance in terms of how we might proceed moving forward, but also perhaps in doing some reflection on what we might have done differently or should have done differently, or perhaps giving ourselves a stamp of approval for having acted well. And of course, we can revisit all of these points. But let's now talk a little bit about the intermediate or social cognitive systems of whole trait theory. So these systems, the intermediate system consists of several interlocking systems, including the interpretative, motivational, and temporal systems. So the interpretative system is where we mainly think that the 5 parts of phronesis can be accommodated within the larger whole trait theory. So it includes what Raymond Cattell called crystallized structures such as propositional, episodic, and procedural know-how, knowledge, schemas, prototypes, scripts, roles, episodes, and so forth. These structures allow us to store past experiences and use them to perceive and process new instances of trait-relevant stimuli efficiently. So it also includes what Cattell called our more fluid capacities for analyzing, reasoning, problem solving, and perspective taking. So included here would also be basic capacities for social cognition, for example, emotional intelligence and theory of mind. So just to give a very brief example here, we've all traveled in airports, and so we all know what it's like to struggle with big suitcases, okay? So we have a script, right, or schema for how to navigate an airport with our luggage. And this allows us, I mean, we build this up through past experiences, and we know what we need to do to move our luggage from one place to another, okay? So what does this have to do with trait relevant stimuli? Well, maybe we see someone struggling with a large suitcase. That's a trait relevant stimulus because we know the script about what needs to happen with our suitcases, right? We know we need to grab them off of the luggage conveyor belt when they come off. And so we could see somebody struggling with that. And that is a trait relevant stimulus. Now, our fluid capacities for analyzing and reasoning and problem solving, perspective taking, for example, then should kick in. So we see this person struggling to get their luggage off the baggage claim check trolley or conveyor belt. We know the script, we know what has to happen. And so then we can say to ourselves, well, if I were in that situation, I'd want a hand, right? There's perspective taking. We don't go through all this in our head. this all comes to us naturally if we have the virtue, right? But then we know, hey, I should walk up and help that person get the suitcase. So there's a problem solving. So there's a very simple, I think, rather mundane example of how phronesis comes into play here with respect to the interpretative system and helps us to act on the trait relevant stimulus of seeing someone struggling to get their luggage off a conveyor belt in an airport. Let's see what else. So we have perception of an interpretation here. So the interpretative system is central to how stimuli in a person's environment are perceived as trait relevant and interpreted as calling for trait appropriate responses. And I just gave an example of that, right? So you perceive this person struggling with their luggage as trait relevant, and you interpret that as calling for a compassionate response, namely lending a hand, okay? So the interpretative system would encompass the parts of phronesis already discussed in connection with perception, comprehension, sense, and intelligence, right? And so I think we see that from the example of the luggage. If so, this interpretative element is already built into our perception of virtue relevant stimuli. And so this makes perfect sense. We don't typically receive uninterpreted stimuli, that is, stimuli of which we cannot make sense. So the vast preponderance of stimuli is interpreted by us and is made intelligible to us by interpretation. So if you're looking at this slide right now, you should see on the right-hand portion of it, two masks or two depictions of masks. And what you see there are already interpreted as masks, right? And one is interpreted as smiling and one is interpreted as unhappy. So there's a smiling happy mask. There is the unsmiling unhappy mask. And that has all been interpreted by you, right? So you're not saying, well, what I perceive are a combination of dark green and light green, dark green lines on light green backgrounds, right? You're interpreting them in light of your experiences and scripts and schemas, prototypes, and so on. This is how we encounter the world when we are of a certain age. Maybe when we're very young, we just get raw, uninterpreted stimuli, but as we age, as we grow, and as we learn, those interpretations come into play with respect to everything that we experience. So, just as I gave an earlier example here, I'll let you read this. We can see how comprehension, sense, and intelligence easily fit into crystallized and fluid knowledge structures, which are part of this larger interpretative system, okay? So all of these parts of phronesis, comprehension, sense, and intelligence, are contextualized and work in conjunction with our crystallized and fluid knowledge structures and are deepened by them as we go through life. And of course, the knowledge structures aren't normatively neutral, but are informed by the mores of our culture. So we all have different knowledge structures. We all have different scripts and schemas, depending on our cultures and our social learning histories. Of course, some of those are shared, but some of them are not. So moving on here, let's talk a bit about deliberative excellence and cleverness. These weren't mentioned in connection with perception because they're really concerned with deliberation, but they can be subsumed under the types of fluid capacities already mentioned, especially the abilities to analyze, reason, and solve problems. And it's pretty clear how that happens. I mean, if we deliberate well, we're solving problems well. We are analyzing and reasoning well. And if we're clever in terms of phronesis, we're doing the same thing in terms of means, ends, reasoning. So let's have a brief word about the motivational system. The motivational system is another feature of the explanatory side of whole trait theory. It includes desires to attain certain ends and to avoid others. Desired ends are interpreted as good and aversive ends as bad. But the ends in question can be morally bad, morally good, or morally neutral. So whole trait theory is large enough to admit, but it's not limited to the kinds of goods of interest to virtue ethics. So whole trait theory can admit that possessors of phronesis are motivated to pursue, at the most general level, global human goods, and at more specific levels of their own lives, goods that relate to global human goods, like the desire for family, the desire for friends, the desire for meaningful work that relate to flourishing, okay? The point, however, is that phronesis can't exist unless it's motivated by the desire to be virtuous and to pursue the kinds of goods that virtue enables us to attain, okay? Consequently, we can use the whole trait framework of perception and the interpretative system to explain much about phronesis, but unless we specify that motivational component for which reference to the motivational system is required, we will have missed a necessary feature of phronesis, its integral connection with virtue and virtuous motivation. So within the whole ambit of whole trait theory, we really can't do without some reference to motivation. We can explain a lot of phronesis, in fact, probably the lion's share in terms of the interpretative system, but we do need to say something about motivation. And so, hang on for a sec, sorry about that. We can revisit these four roles for phronesis, okay, within the context of the interpretative system and the motivational system, okay? So action guidance, as you know, depends not only on our abilities of perception, but also on deliberation. So we use all of these things. And the interpretive system of whole trait theory offers a framework that can readily explain how we use phronesis, how we use deliberation and means-ends reasoning. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with this. Again, for this regulative role, the same structures and deliberative processes are at work in the second role for phronesis, its regulative role with respect to multiple virtues. So here what is deliberated about is more complex than deciding on a single action, but we don't need to posit separate knowledge structures or reasoning capacities. The same ones identified by whole trait theory are as applicable to these questions as to the question of a single virtuous action. And how best to carry it out. Emotion regulation, similar considerations apply, right? So once you figure out how to explain action guidance using the interpretative system, you can use those same knowledge structures to explain the adjudication of virtues, multiple virtue regulation, and emotion regulation. Finally, there is one further point to be made in terms of reflection on one's life as a whole. Okay, so a more complex range of considerations come into play here. Not only knowledge of motivational systems, but also the temporal system of whole trait theory. So the temporal system, which I haven't explained, is at its most basic level a system that, quote, accounts for the influences of past events on the present. And whole trait theory goes into a lot of detail about this that isn't really relevant to our concern. But for our concern, we need to know that past influences, the influences of past events exert consistent patterns of influence on trait expression over time at a higher order level of metacognitive processing, okay? So these experiences of past and the anticipation of future events exert an influence on present trait manifestation. So let's talk about this in a little bit more detail, which I hope is a bit clearer. So phronetic reflection on one's life as a whole helps us to construct narrative identity, right? So we have lives that extend through time. And as our lives extend through time, we reflect on who we are. And we reflect on who we are using our past experiences, using our present experiences, and projecting ourselves into the future. So all of this involves phronesis, right? So reflection on memories, this is where the temporal system comes into play. Memories of past events, episodes, and even longer temporal periods can influence present reflection on who we are and who we want to become with respect to virtue. We can remember a past episode of wrongdoing with shame and resolve to do better, or we can remember ourselves at a longer interval of past time, observing upon reflection, for example, how impulsive and immature we were as a young person and how we are calmer and more settled now. But just reflection on the past with respect to our present selves is not all there is to the temporal system. My mouse is out of control. Okay, we have imaginative projections too. So we can imaginatively project the kind of person we want to be into the future, right? Perhaps envisioning ourselves having the virtues we desire and living our lives accordingly. So we can use that imaginative projection of ourselves to plan for more imminent future events. So I might recall, however, that I used to be very impulsive when I was younger. Now I'm calmer and more settled. Now I'm more deliberative. And it's that more calm, settled, deliberative self that I want to project into the future. I don't want to go back to the more impulsive self of my younger days, right? So it's that I project a certain image of myself using the temporal system to think about how I want to be in the future, to distance myself from how I was in the past. All of that is phronetic reflection that is in the construction of a narrative identity that we use to identify with certain traits, being calmer, more settled, more deliberative, and disidentify with other traits, being impulsive. So this we can call mental time travels, and this has been explored in psychological literature. So mental time travels consist on our phronetic reflections on our lives, which take us back and forth through time, revisiting our past experiences with an eye to diagnosing our strengths and our weaknesses, and imagining ourselves with an enhanced moral identity into the future. So that enhanced moral identity is going to help us lead a good life, the life we want, right? And so again, these mental time travels enable us to construct a narrative identity and thus give shape and meaning to our lives. So you can see here why, given that my colleagues and I are adopting this position on how a narrative identity is constructed, we're not that keen on the blueprint view, right? Which, posits that there is this previously existing blueprint. Now, the proponent of blueprints might say, look, you're just filling out the contours of your blueprint, but we want to retain the notion that we can, in fact, and should, in fact, change the blueprint as our knowledge increases and as our desires to be virtuous deepen, given the deepening of our knowledge. So I think that is it. So thank you very much. I appreciate your attention, and I will stop sharing my screen now and open the floor to discussion, I think.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Nancy, for your beautiful presentation. Very dense, very intense also. So now we have at least half an hour for discussion. So I'm already seeing hands. I think that the first one was Michele Mangini and then Michelle. So I think we can start with these, and also Maria Silvia, who actually, welcome, Maria Silvia. We can see you. So I would give the floor to these first three questions. Michele, please.
Thank you, Claudia, and thank you, Nancy, for your very stimulating presentation. As you know, I side with you. I cannot say 100%, but close to. I just have a few puzzles about what you said, not so much in the second part concerning more of the psychological part, but the first part. Virtue and phronesis. From what you said, can we talk in both cases as satis concepts, as Dan Russell tends to introduce his idea of the virtues? He refers to the virtues as satis concepts. I am not sure he was referring also to phronesis, but from what you said, it seems they are satis concepts because there is something that is not present in its fullest form, but is something that can be present just partly and even develop. Now, the idea of development to me seems to be something that should come to your view as a possibility, in the sense that you want to reject blueprint view, but from many hints in your talk, such as the repeated address of the idea of the whole of one's life, referring to one's identity and so on, it seems that you are not so far away from the blueprint view. Only maybe what you are aiming at is something we can call as a developmental blueprint view, something that can change through time and be present in our life at different stages in our development in different degrees. Of course, what you were referring as your different personal path in life seems to address exactly this point, and it is a point which is common to most of us. So I tend to be quite skeptical about the possibility of getting completely away from the blueprint view if we want to talk about a concept such as phronesis, which in Aristotelian terms is by necessity addressed to the whole of a life and the conception of one's good, within which the virtues are one of the primary elements. I don't want to be longer than that, and I hope that I was clear in what I was aiming at. Thank you.
Yes, very clear. Thank you for your questions. In terms of the satis concept, yes, I agree. Just how much of the virtue needs to be present in order to be considered to satisfy that, I don't know. In terms of the developmental view, most definitely, I agree. In terms of the blueprint view, I just have a little bit of, I mean, when does the blueprint start? So that's my question. And how does the blueprint start? And it seems to me that we get blueprints from our cultures and our societies, right? So I have a blueprint of my life. You have a blueprint of yours. Mine took quite a while to develop, but it was indexed to my culture and my situation. And I think we need to be careful because somehow phronesis has to be able to correct that. So if I get a blueprint of something that is immoral, maybe I was raised in a family of thieves. No, I wasn't, but maybe I was. And then, I would have been expected to carry on in the fine tradition of thievery to which my family was committed. Now, phronesis somehow has to be able to correct that blueprint. But I mean, I think I'm struggling. I mean, let me put it this way. I am struggling with the blueprint view and with how much is present at what time and where that blueprint comes from and how we need to be able to correct it and what are the critical mechanisms, the critical deliberative mechanisms that allow us to step outside of our own situations and maybe even our own cultures and societies to correct what is morally awry with the blueprints that we're given. So if I had wanted to go along with the blueprint that I was actually given when I was growing up, I wouldn't be a philosopher, right? I wouldn't be talking to you here. I would be in my home in Southern Illinois, probably a secretary or a, in some service role with a family. And instead, I'm here giving a talk on phronesis with my 2 cats. And so it's a very different blueprint from what I was originally handed. And my guess is that many people are in a similar situation. So I mean, I think you Michaela, not surprisingly, have put your finger on something that needs a lot more thought in this view. So thank you for pointing that out. That's a terrible answer, because it's it's just saying, yeah, you're right, I need to do a lot more thinking about this. And you're probably right too, that I'll never ever actually be able to get away from the blueprint view, because it just seems to be ubiquitous and with us in some form or other. So that's my unsatisfactory answer. But thank you for your wonderful question.
Thank you, Nancy.
So I don't know who's next.
My microphone was off, so Michelle, it's your turn.
Thanks, Nancy. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I just have a very little question about the motivational component of phronesis, which I might have lost in your slide. I mean, the question might just be phrased like this. I got the impression from the whole description of the account and when you combine it with the whole trait theory that, and from your examples as well, that phronesis is what allows us to act virtuously in a variety of situations where we might need, so many different virtues. But the worry I had, the question I had is, why would we need to be motivated to become phronimos or something like that? I mean, to develop phronesis, couldn't it be just that we need to have the right motivation to act virtuously, compassionately in this situation, or whenever it's required, and to be humble, to act humbly whenever it's required, and that phronesis serves as a kind of a, maybe instrumental is a bad phrasing, but at least it gives you the idea. Because if it felt like it was epistemic and instrumental enough, the account you gave, that I kind of got lost why this motivational component is so important.
Oh, thank you very much. But the only reason I brought up the motivational component was to try to be clear about which of the systems in whole trait theory would need to be invoked in order for that framework to be used to explain phronesis. So I wasn't trying to encourage us all to become phronemoi. Okay, what I was trying to do is to say, look, in terms of using the whole trait theory as a psychological theory for thinking about a neo-Aristotelian conception of phronesis, we can't just use the interpretative framework. Okay, we also have to make this posit of a specific motivation, right? And whole trait theory doesn't mention, they've got maybe an article about one article about whether whole trait theory can be used for virtues, but the developed view does not mention any specific kinds of motivations. So if we're going to talk about Aristotle, we have to put that in. And that was the only point that I wanted to make. Yeah, thank you for that question.
Okay, so Maria Silvia.
Yeah, thanks. First of all, hi, Nancy. I'm sorry I was a little late. I was in a previous meeting. It's great to see you. But I managed to hear all of your beautiful presentation. It was great. So
thank you.
I've just 2 points. One is a question and one is an expression of appreciation, let's say. The question is about the, let's say, a methodological point or something like that. So I was fascinated by your overview of the different accounts of the components of phronesis. And then you offered your own, which is quite convincing to me. But my question is, when I read these attempts, or I attempt myself to define features of phronesis, I ask myself, what's the correct way of identifying features? So I'm not, even if I'm trying to do so myself, I'm not sure how should we really and honestly, let's say, identify the core features of phronesis. So we can go interpretive, let's say, and check what Aristotle had to say about components or features of phronesis, or we can try to, I don't know, describe the phenomenology of how we act phronetically. So what's your way to do that? That would be very interesting to me to know. And the second point was, I really appreciate your connection of phronesis with the construction of narrative identity and the link you find with an idea of moral development and moral progress, which is something in virtue ethical terms is not so often discussed. I mean, we talk about virtue development, but we seldom discuss how can we change our blueprint, or how can we like operate a paradigm shift in our lives. So in this let's say moral progress yeah, I mean, I don't think we have a virtue ethical theory of moral progress. That's what I wanted to say. I mean, we have a theory of virtue education, but we refer to like educating kids mostly. But I don't know if you agree, but I don't think we have a proper virtue ethical theory of moral progress, moral transformation, and one which is capable of accounting for transformative experiences, for epiphanies and so on. I don't know if you agree, or this is something you'd like to develop more, because I do.
Well, thank you. I'll take the easy question first, or the easier one of the two. I don't think there's a sufficient account of moral development or moral progress, pardon me, or moral transformation. I think it's an incredibly complex question, incredibly complex issue. It would be something that I think will be on the agenda for virtue ethicists as we move forward. I also think that another important thing that is lacking in the virtue ethicist agenda, which we need to pay attention to, is an account of moral repair. And I don't think that very much work at all has been done on this, and we need to start paying attention to it. So those are my glib, superficial answers to your really important second question. And then in terms of the earlier question about phronesis, you know, for years I tried to avoid phronesis because it was just too hard. And then some people invited, so 2 people from Italy invited a paper on phronesis. And I won't say who they are, but I was forced then to start thinking really more seriously about phronesis. And so, you know, we went to, my colleagues and I, my colleagues said, okay, you do the heavy lifting on this one. I said, okay, fine. And so I went to the extant work, and Dan Russell has what I think is the, you know, the primary source on this. So I used Russell's account mainly, which went back to the Greek. I don't know Greek, so I am at the mercy of translators. But he went back to the Greek and looked up these, what he calls the suite of virtues, which are the 5 parts of phronesis. Now, it's very difficult when you're thinking about the phenomenology of this. That's another way of going about it. You know, what happens when we do think about virtue? What happens, right? It's very difficult to separate out those components. You can do it, but it has sort of an artificial feel to it, right? And so in another piece of work, from ordinary virtue to Aristotelian virtue, I described how somebody, a sort of hypothetical situation in which a young father becomes fully virtuous in the Aristotelian sense, starts off with this goal of being a good father, and then recognizes through a series of phronetic reflections the instrumental value of virtue, the constitutive value of virtue, and the intrinsic value of virtue. So there are various ways of going about doing this. Which way is the best? I really don't know. I don't know. I guess it depends on what you want to do. If you want to remain as faithful as possible to Aristotle, then you go the Dan Russell route. If you want to figure out how ordinary people might try to use something like phronesis in their lives, then you go the phenomenological account and think about how, you know, recognitions of the value of virtue come to being, come to full fruition. I think those are probably distinct ways, and maybe that they will converge on the same thing. I just don't know. I really don't know. But I've tried both. I've tried both, and I'm not happy with where I'm at in terms of my understanding of phronesis. It's just a very elusive concept, at least in Aristotle. So that's my answer to your first question.
Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, Mario.
Thank you, Nancy. You have given us a lot of food for thought. And so the first thought is, at some point you said that one way of presenting phronesis is a deliberation that guides virtuous action. So in some sense, orientates or gives direction to the virtues. And so my question is, what is the relationship of phronesis and the virtues? Because, you know, there is Christian Miller, for example, that says there are only the virtues. And Maria Silvia and I try to say that instead there is phronesis primarily. It's phronesis that constitutes the virtues. In some sense, virtues are the manifestation of phronesis, not something that exists in themselves. So I wonder what you think about the relationship between phronesis and the virtues.
I think you don't have virtue without phronesis. I just think you don't. You have something else. Maybe, and here I'm very Aristotelian. Maybe you have natural virtue, right? Maybe you have something that is sort of unreflective and uninformed by reason, okay? So that you don't really need to think about what you're doing. But for to have full virtue, I think you need to have phronesis. So, I mean, I depart from Christian Miller. I depart from people like Julia Driver. I don't even know that she has a theory of something that could be called a virtue or a trait. But I do think, along with Russell, that if you don't have phronesis, you can't really have virtue. So I suppose that I am closer to you and Maria Silvia than I am to these other theorists who are happy in dispensing with phronesis, because I'm not. You know, I just don't know. I can't imagine a virtuous life without phronesis. You know, I can't imagine a flourishing life without phronesis. And I wonder what that would look like.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just, I'm in agreement.
Thank you. Next question is Angelos. I can't see here. Okay.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, sure. We can
Many thanks, because I have very much appreciated your speech, because it's very wide, very also, I think, analytic and continental somehow, because you're speaking about narrative, and you give a very wide idea of phronesis. But I have a very simple question. We are speaking about moral development, so moral. And so when we say this is bad, do we have moral intuitions? Do you think that there is a background of moral intuitions when we use phronesis or not? Or perhaps these moral intuitions have a ground in the basis in memory, for instance, as you say, in memory. Or I think that very often they are in memory. But no, if we are very sure that this is bad, no, so we may use a phronesis, and then we have to interpret. We need an interpretation of the situation. But this is an old topic, do you know? No, But what do you think about it?
I think you're right. I think you're right, Angelo. Very good to see you, by the way, and congratulations on your retirement.
Very good.
Thank you. I think you're right, Angelo. I think you're right, and I think that that we do have intuitions about what counts as morally good, morally bad. That those intuitions are crafted and honed through our use of phronesis. That all of this is contextualized within culture, in society, and the reason, and that it is stored in memory, right? So, you know, you might memorize, you might remember something that happened a number of years ago. And back then you thought, oh, that was fine. And now that you're older and you're wiser and you have been through phronetic reflections, I think, oh, I can't believe I did that. How horrible, okay? But I think that there is also some scientific evidence for the view that you present. So I don't know if folks here are familiar with the work of Stanley Klein. Stanley Klein is a neuroscientist who has done some really interesting work on memory and its role in morals. And I got interested in this a number of years ago and sort of had to set it aside. But he discusses a case of an individual that he studied, an actual individual that he studied, who had some brain injury due to a motorcycle accident. And this individual could not remember any of his traits, so any of his virtues. And so this is very much like the case of Phineas Gage, which I'm sure some people are familiar with through the work of Antonio Damasio. You know, an individual who suffered brain damage, and just his character changed. That was the Phineas Gage character. Character completely changed. In the case of the Stanley Klein individual, the person could not remember any traits that he had. So people were expecting to find a person who had the traits of the person they remembered. So, you know, pre-accident, this guy might have been very charitable, very compassionate. Post-accident, he had no memory of that. He didn't know what those traits were. So yeah, I mean, I think that provides at least some very suggestive evidence that we do store moral intuitions in memory, that we do hold them, and that then when our memories are damaged, you know, through accidents or brain lesions or whatever, we lose those and then have to relearn them. So this motorcycle crash victim had to relearn these traits. So yeah, I absolutely agree with what you're saying. And my reading of what small reading that I have done on the science of this topic completely agrees with you.
Thanks, many thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I think now it's my turn. I also raised my hand. So among them, so many interesting, things that you have said in your presentation. I would like to pick just two specific points. Mm-hmm. The first one is about emotion regulation. And I would like to know if, according to World Trade Theory, it is also true, or it is likely, that phronesis works not only as an emotion regulator, but also as a protector against the emotional dysregulation, to be intended not only as the inability of displaying the right emotion in the right moment, in the right situation, and so on, as Aristotle says, but also to feel, I would say, the right or the proper or the suitable amount and dimension and way of the same emotion, because sometimes also the correct or the right emotion for the situation can go in different directions and become dysregulated because it's not, I would say, in that kind of intermediate way of balancing the different opposites. And I don't know if this is something similar to what our friend Christian said when speaking about the virtuous emotions as emotions, not virtues, but with this kind of moral dimension in terms of being regulated. So I'm just wondering whether according to your account, phronesis plays a role in this kind of preventing emotional dysregulation. And the other point I've been very interested by is the idea you develop of a perspective related to phronesis. Perspective, which, if I understood right, could be understood on the one side as a perspective towards the future. So this way that phronesis allows of going back and forth from past experiences and projections towards the future in building our narrative identity. So a perspective which is related to time, and also perspective which is related to, I would say, content, so a kind of open-mindedness. And I would like to know if you think that this particular feature of perspective could be interpreted also as, I would say, the ability of the phronimos of finding the best moral explanation for a fact, either a behavior or an event, which actually I called in a paper I wrote a few months ago, phronetic abduction, as this capability of seeing the picture in terms of an explanation, a moral explanation, the best moral explanation for a fact. Would you think that this kind of interpretation is consistent with this idea of perspective that you described? Thank you very much.
A perspective, is that what you said?
That you described, that you developed in your presentation, the perspective dimension of phronesis.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Okay. All right. Well, emotion regulation and dysregulation. So in the paper, I don't know if this survived into the actual chapter, but I had put some things into the paper about emotion regulation based on the work of the neuroscientist Kevin Oaksner. And so Oaksner had done a series of experiments in which he asked subjects to look at portrayals of various events, and then to take certain perspectives on the people in the events. So, you were to imagine that you yourself were, in this movie, right? Something like that. So that the bad thing was happening to you, or the bad thing was happening to one of your family members. And the emotions that were detected, and this was an fMRI test, or the brain activity. So it wasn't really emotions that were detected, but the brain activity indicating which areas of the brain were active changed, right? Depending on what the person was imagining himself or herself seeing, okay? So now, what these experiments really showed is that we are capable of either upregulating or downregulating our emotional responses. Meaning when we upregulate, we intensify our emotional responses. When we downregulate, we tamp them down. I think phronesis is responsible for that in the virtuous person. So in the virtuous person, it's phronesis that prevents you from getting so angry that it's unjustified anger, right? So, Aristotle famously thought that a certain amount of anger could be justified, which is true. I mean, I think, if somebody is being very disrespectful or offensive, yeah, you can be mad, okay? But you can't be so mad that it's disproportionate to the offense. And I believe phronesis does that. Phronesis helps us to keep our emotional regulation balanced and in tune with what we need to do to be virtuous. Many examples of this abound, right? Emotion also, say for example, something has gone wrong in our lives or in our career or with our children, and we feel like a failure, and you start beating yourself up, right? Well, phronesis is what helps balance you, and it does have to do with taking a perspective on things. So this, I think, gets us into the sort of time question about phronesis, right? That in terms of time, phronesis also helps us to kind of level off some of our emotional reactions that might be too intense given a specific fact. And so this is where content and open-mindedness, as you suggest, come in. And I think also there is the possibility of a role for what you have called phronetic abduction, right? The phronetic person then goes to the best moral explanation of the fact. Well, it's the best moral explanation of the fact that you have been a failure as a parent, or it's the best moral explanation of the fact something else, that your child is subjected to multiple influences, that you can't have control over him or her all the time, that some things are out of your control, and so on and so forth. And so this phronetic abduction then would enable you to stop beating yourself up, stop being so hard on yourself, stop the kind of emotional dysregulation that you are feeling in response to this particular event. So I think it all works together rather nicely in terms of what you suggest. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. Perfectly. Thank you. Thanks a lot. I will keep on thinking about that, because, I found your, your topic and also your presentation very stimulating and inspiring. So I think that I need to think a little more about that and also about your answer, but I find it convincing. So thank you.
Good. Thank you.
A lot.
Good. Thank you.
Now I think we have another question, Johannes.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much for a really fascinating talk. I have a question of clarification about something which I'm not entirely sure I even got sort of superficially right. You seem to refer at various points to systems.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't quite sure, so I was just wondering whether you can say more about what goes into systems as you understand them. Are we talking about subpersonal systems here, or are we talking about still the personal level of description? And if the former, as I assume, because that's what people usually have in mind when they talk about systems, I was just wondering what kind of weight this part of the theory carries. Is it, or is the theory as a whole just a theory of a certain ensemble of subpersonal systems, or is it about the personal level capacity, various personal level capacities, and then a further claim as to what underpins those capacities? That is to say, a sort of philosophical articulation of the way we think about people, various capacities of people, plus psychological theory, or which would look to be a sort of fusion of two quite different elements. I take it wasn't meant to be that, but so this is just a request for further clarification. Thank you.
Sure. The whole trait theory is a psychological theory. And the whole trait theory has the two sides, the descriptive and the explanatory. The language about systems comes up as part of the explanatory system, because what whole trait theory wants to do is to look at the behavioral manifestation of traits. And they do this through what they call density distributions. That is to say, they measure the numbers of times and the frequency of situations in which people display certain traits. So that's the descriptive side. And then the system side, the explanatory side, consists of the postulation of various systems, the inputs, the social cognitive systems, which are the intermediate systems, and the outputs, which are in fact the behaviors, right? Or the emotional reactions. So that explanatory side is meant to explain how people act. And those systems are subpersonal systems. Now, the psychologists don't make philosophical claims, or they don't make many. And so what my colleagues and I have done in our book and in this paper that I presented is sort of use that theory to integrate and make trying to make some headway in terms of making neo-Aristotelian virtue ethics more amenable to measurement. So we think that the whole trait theory with its explanatory side can really help us to measure virtue by providing the language and the systems that are common. Really, they're common to neo-Aristotelianism, okay, and psychology. So there are many psychological systems and theories that don't share that overlap. They're just different. But I think whole trait theory, being social cognitive, is closer to that. So I don't know if this answers your question at all, but as a philosopher, I've put in all the philosophical stuff here, all the philosophical assumptions, all the philosophical terms, you know, all the argumentation that phronesis can be explained in terms of this framework. And my colleagues in psychology have done the work in terms of identifying those aspects of the systems that are amenable to explaining how phronesis works using this framework. So the systems are all subpersonal, but they are all dedicated to explaining how traits are expressed and manifested in our lives. Does that make sense?
Thank you. No, that's really helpful. Thanks a lot.
Sure.
So thank you. I don't see any other hands, so I don't know if there are any questions. We have a very productive discussion. So I think if there aren't any questions, we could also, end our conversation, our talk, tonight's talk, which actually was so rich of contents and stimuli, and I think you gave really a terrific contribution to our reflection about phronesis we've been, having these months. And so after that, I think that we can, say bye-bye to each other, and also, wish happy holidays to everybody. I just want to remind that our next talk will be next year, in January 21st. We will have Darshan Norvais giving her talk. And so thank you again so much to Nancy. Really, thanks a lot for this contribution, for being with us tonight, and wish you very good time from the time being.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, for having me, and for very stimulating and wonderful questions.
Thanks a lot. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.